Good afternoon, everyone. These have been 3 very interesting days for me. I've heard a lot of insights from a lot of people with very different backgrounds. What I want to talk about is technically part of the economy and ecology section, but certainly, as you have seen, the connections among the 3 divisions that the organizers of the conference have cleverly adopted are really many. Social issues of transnational nature are inextricably connected with security issues and geopolitical issues. And the world economy is inextricably linked to them. So my intention here today is to provide you with some signposts related somewhat to the things that you have heard and also some things that you may have not heard. First and foremost, the world economy is very complex. Why? The first thing that comes to mind is there is an extremely large number of countries, 193. Nearly 4 times as many the number that existed when the United Nations was founded. What does this mean? A tremendous interaction between them. Also, as a consequence of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the changed attitude toward markets of many countries, up to that point not interested in participating in what we call the world economy, we have had a great increase in interaction across the borders, fostered also by very significant changes of a technological nature in transportation and communication. This presents formidable challenges for data gathering and data analysis, as anyone who works at UN or at the European Union or at the OECD knows all too well, or at any one of the interdevelopment, local banks, international banks, and all that. There is one cluster of ideas, though, that is a must to concentrate on to understand the world economy, and it has to do with economic growth. Economic growth is followed very attentively by money managers worldwide, because in one simple number, GDP, you convey a lot of information about the standard of living of a country. The biggest story behind the GDP is that, the most recent one actually, and also the biggest, is that out of the world crisis, the 2007-2009 world recession, using the National Bureau of Economic Research dating system, of course, so it's a US-centered perspective from this point of view. Out of that crisis, the emerging markets and developing countries in general have emerged with faster growth rates. This continues a trend that unequivocally has been observed since the beginning of the new century. Faster growth in developing countries. So, that is, as Angus Maddison has cleverly taught us, a form of catching up. Don't forget that up to 1820, emerging markets were essentially, what we call emerging markets, were essentially 80% of the world economy, 80. Then, in the West, the Industrial Revolution took place and permitted all the people in this room to enjoy the higher standards of living that we have compared to large swaths of mankind. So, analyzing economic growth is very useful. It gives you a clear number, gives us a sense of trend. So GDP growth is important to understand reality, the reality of the world economy. Associated to it, there is a categorization. Emerging markets can be called, of course, there are the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. Some people want to remove Russia, want to put in Indonesia, but you get the gist of it. It's also a category that interestingly moves because there is another category proposed called that of the overlooked countries. Well, the overlooked countries are South Africa, Botswana, Mauritius, and Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia. Something has changed, of course, since this typology was created because risk, the ever-present element in any economic and political analysis, has told us that North Africa was not, in risk terms, what we thought it was. So these categories of overlooked frontier markets are characterized, and frontier markets are poorer than the overlooked category, are characterized by vast fluctuation in growth and therefore in risk. Then there is a four-speed world, a distinction proposed by OECD, affluent countries, us in the West, converging markets, where there are consistently higher growth rates, and then there are struggling markets, poor countries. The gist of it, this is a classification proposed by OECD. The gist of these classifications is their fluctuations. So keep in mind, these categories are useful, but they fluctuate. And they are related to another important concept, decoupling. Decoupling is very important. What does it mean? Well, it means there used to be a very facile way of defining the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world. When the United States catches a cold, the developing countries get pneumonia. Who hasn't heard this story? But is decoupling working or not? Look at what has happened with the latest crisis. We have seen a continuation of a certain trend that had already been seen with the previous ones, in which emerging markets and developing economies have experienced less of a negative impact. Clearly, this crisis' most distinguished feature is the fact that it has started in the West, in the United States, and we know all about it, and we can talk about it in the Q&A. But what is most interesting is how the developing markets have responded to it, in the sense that they had a greater ability to emerge out of it. And it was because they had a bigger cushion in terms of foreign exchange reserves. And here comes history, and they had learned a very important lesson from the 97-98 crisis, the Asian crisis, that being subject to capital inflows and outflows of a very short-term nature can really wreak havoc with your economy. So there was a great, great effort at accumulating reserves. So decoupling is a useful concept. The other concept that is useful in understanding the world economy is that coming from the ease or difficulty of doing business in emerging markets or in developing countries. And here there is a famous publication by the World Bank that emphasizes how easy or difficult it is to open and close a business and takes you to all the stages in between. It does not deal with many macro risks. It does not deal with political risks. So it's limited in that sense. But it's still a number that is very much used by money managers and practitioners. Don't forget, decision makers look for shortcuts and easy answers. In addition to doing business, there is another set of challenges, is those of a predictive nature with regard to the stability of a country. Here, Ian Bremmer came up with a very interesting construct. He essentially picture a two-dimensional graph in which you have openness on the x-axis and instability on the y-axis. As openness increases, instability goes down. We have seen it in Africa. We see it everywhere. The openness deriving from access to television programs, access to the internet, and all that. The logic is, however, that at one point there is a point, a virtuous point, if you wish, where the trend reverses and the greater openness leads to greater stability. Handling that segment in which the instability, the openness increases and the level of stability goes down is where you really have a problem. Okay? So that's an important dimension. The other dimension to keep in mind that there was also another J-curve, another analytical construct, conceptualized by a fellow of a previous generation, Davis, who says that you have to monitor the difference between the expectations people have and their perceived needs. If their perceived needs, and they can be fueled by watching television, once again, by comparing their status with other individuals in the country, the famous rich and famous, or individuals in other countries. If that distance of what I think I need and what I'm getting gets too big, then you have the risk of revolution. So political analysts tend to look at these things. Another cluster of ideas that is also crucial to make sense of the world economy evolves around the types of capitalism. One of them is state-guided capitalism. The typologies of capitalism are crucial. If you think about state-guided capitalism, you obviously think about China with its ability to pick winners, presumably. We have also learned from the Japanese example that picking winners is not always easy. And then there is oligarchic capitalism, the favoring of one's own family, the family of the autocrat usually. Then there is big firm capitalism, giant enterprises. You find that in continental Europe, Japan, Korea. And entrepreneurial capitalism, supposedly in the United States. But let's be very clear. Even the authors of the typology, a colleague of mine at NYU, Bomo, most prominently, alert you to the fact that no country has just one form of this kind of capitalism. So be clever. Combine them in understanding where they are going and what they should be doing. Then this is economic growth, and I just touched upon it because we don't have a lot of time. Then there is another cluster of issues that is going to be monitored and is going to be the object of great debate in the months and years ahead. It has to do with inequality. There is one cluster of ideas coming from the reading of The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett that centers on one central premise. More unequal societies have more social problems. Okay? Specifically, countries with the biggest difference between the rich and the poor have more violence, higher teenage birth rates, more obesity, lower level of trust, lower levels of child well-being. I mean, what better proof that government intervention is needed? But you can imagine, obviously, that a book like that had to cause a rebuttal. And the rebuttal is the following. No, the authors neglect to mention that suicide rates, alcohol consumption, divorce rates, HIV infection rates are all higher in more egalitarian societies. And they criticize also their bivariate use of statistics. So that's going to be a big debate. But the debate on inequality is enriched, so to speak, it is enriched by another way of thinking about it. It's suggested by Milanovic, who works at the World Bank. You have to look at inequality within a country, which is the inequality that you see, the one that you see in the country you live in. You compare people. You have to look at the inequality between countries, which is the one that you see when you travel and you make a mental comparison. I could not live in this place. It would not be pleasant and all that. And then there is the inequality of a global nature, which only now we are grappling with, which puts along a continuum the richest individuals and the poorest individuals. And that's the one whose Gini coefficient, about which you have heard a lot, is the highest. It's even higher than that of specific individual countries. So inequality is going to be a very big debate, in part of debate in the next months and years, also because economic crisis lead to greater talks over distribution of income and wealth. Then another cluster of ideas that is important to keep in mind, it's those related to development. Well, after World War II, and history as usual comes in very handy, after World War II there was what some have called a development consensus. Don't forget, there was Keynesian economics was in control. The Soviet Union had displayed very impressive growth rates. So the kind of development strategies pursued were essentially, let's focus on import substitution. We make things ourselves. Let's subsidize, therefore, infant industries. Let's channel banking credit toward specific sectors or individuals. There was, as you can clearly understand, a very significant role being played by the state. And it was in line with the central planning success stories that were coming from Russia, and also the Keynesian doctrine. And this lasted from 45 approximately to the 70s, and when obviously in the 70s, the oil crisis, the materialization of stagflation, higher rates of unemployment in the West were also accompanied by, in the developing countries, there was a temporary optimism that it was possible to duplicate the success story of the OPEC cartel, and that other cartels in areas such as aluminum, bauxite, bananas were possible. Well, in reality, it didn't happen, and people realized very soon that this new international economic order was not very strong. So rethinking started to take place, and a new paradigm came to the fore. And it was what you know and you have heard about, was the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus was different. The Washington Consensus was based on a decalogue. I'm going to read to you some of the points. Fiscal discipline, reorientation of public expenditures, tax reforms, financial liberalization, trade liberalization. In other words, stabilize, privatize, liberalize. And as usual, there was a connection with the West, because these were the developments, described also by others in this conference, that were coming from Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who had espoused the Friedman type of doctrines of stabilize, privatize, liberalize. Okay? What that meant was that the kind of advice that was being given by individuals from international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, changed. And they become much more market-oriented, and they become much more inclined toward ignoring whatever was feared before, that is, market failures, and instead emphasizing government failures. Okay? So this is something that led to Latin America to liberalize a lot, other countries to liberalize a lot. It's a story that has some nuances to that, and I'll come to that very shortly. The consensus started to show its weaknesses around in the 90s already. And there is a major study conducted by the mid-2000, 2005. So it's available in the paper that I wrote, the reference. according to which by the 2000s the consensus had already lost some momentum. And the new form, an augmented consensus, materialized with new suggestions that related to corporate governance, anti-corruption, and all that. The easiest way to understand this is simply this. The importance of institutions came to the fore. So institutional economics became more important, and this augmented consensus meant you cannot just have liberalization, you must have stronger institutions in place. And here comes again a form of criticism, because people say, you see, the debate on development economics also was transferred to the debate over the usefulness of foreign aid. That's another cluster of ideas can help you orient yourself in this difficult area. So you understand development economics, you understand that you follow you start with the crisis of the post-Washington consensus, and then you ask yourself, what was happening on the front of foreign aid? Well, on the front of foreign aid, there was an equal split. And the split is epitomized by two individuals who happen to live and teach in New York City. One is Jeffrey Sachs, and the other one is William Easterly. Jeffrey Sachs believes that poverty can be remedied with very aggressive intervention, and he would like to see Western countries to conform to the Monterrey Declaration, according to which they would give 0.7% of GDP to the poor countries. He's an interventionist. He believes in so-called top-down approaches. William Easterly counters, well, this is the poverty trap, the tragedy that Sachs and people like him describe are really a very sad thing, but the greatest tragedy is what has happened to the $2.3 trillion given to the developing world in aid with no results whatsoever, or very little to show for it. So William Easterly, therefore, divides the world into planners and seekers and says, Jeffrey Sachs is a planner. He wants to have a top-down approach to life. He wants us from the West to dictate the terms to developing countries of what they should be doing, because we know best. Instead, I am a searcher, he says, and I think we have to find piecemeal solutions to our problems. And with experimentation, with imaginative solutions that create local markets, and so on and so forth. And this is another part of the debate that is very important, including the fact that there is a quantitative verification of the two positions in terms of is aid good and is aid bad. And let me tell you, summarizing the reading of quite a substantial number of papers, the jury is out. We don't know. Other issues still very important to understand for the world economy are obvious, those related to the limitations of the GDP itself. Having started touting the virtues of the GDP at the beginning, I have to tell you there are significant limitations. And, for instance, the Human Development Index tries to remedy those. I can... 5 minutes? Okay. So the Human Development Index is an index that serves the purpose of giving two additional dimensions in a number. So they are the dimensions of health and the dimensions of education. And in that regard, the index points to a lesser unequal world than if we consider just income. Okay? That's the major finding. Understanding the Human Development Index is a great thing, but there are also scholars who say there's much more to it about it. And the Human Development Index does not work well with understanding sustainability, okay? A very important topic, as you all know. And the Human Development Index does not come close to another research area, which I anticipate will grow in the years to come, and is the happiness research. Various happiness indices have been built, and I can tell you, even in this area, there is a marked contrast, because there are some authors that work very hard at demonstrating that the happiness that we have in the West is very illusory, and others who say, nonsense, being in the West is great. I would like to take your questions now.